Maxentius, meanwhile, was having serious problems of his own. His popularity had never recovered, and no longer certain of the loyalty of his subjects, especially during a long siege, he decided to risk everything in a decisive battle. He gathered his forces and marched out to confront the invading army. The site they met was 7 or 8 miles northeast of the city at a place called Saxa Rubra, Red Rocks, and it was here that Constantine had his famous vision, which, according to the historian Lactantius, probably writing 1 or 2 years after the actual event, consisted of a private dream telling him to mark his soldiers with the chi and the rho, the first 2 letters in Greek of Christ's name. Armed with the new certainty of divine favor, Constantine routed his opponent and chased him all the way back to the old Milvian Bridge. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge left Constantine in supreme control of the West, but more importantly, it marks the beginning of his active protection of Christianity, and in light of the consequences, a watershed moment in history. Constantine himself would date his conversion to this point. For the moment, however, he had to tread very carefully. On his triumphal arch, still standing just outside the Colosseum, he made no mention of Christ, merely saying that he was instinct with divinity, whatever that means. He then met with Licinius, his elderly counterpart in the East, and together they decided to issue an edict of toleration, again worded very carefully, which made no mention of a particular god, merely saying, reverence for the deity, and whatsoever divinity dwells in heaven. The 2 emperors then sealed their new friendship with the marriage of Licinius and Constantine's daughter, Constantia. They then agreed to issue another proclamation giving Christianity full legal recognition across the empire. At this moment, however, Licinius got word that the 3rd Augustus, Maximinus Daia, had invaded his territory with 70,000 troops and seized the small town of Byzantium. Once again, it was Christian versus pagan, as Licinius fought under the banner of the cross, and Maximinus Daia had vowed to eradicate Christianity if the gods gave him victory. Unfortunately for Maximinus Daia, his generalship was not as strong as his faith, and the much older Licinius, though heavily outnumbered, managed to pull off a stunning victory. Maximinus Daia, disguised as a slave, fled the battlefield, but, relentlessly pursued, decided to commit suicide. Unfortunately, he chose a particularly slow poison that drove him mad to the point where he was eating handfuls of dirt and took an agonizing 4 days to die. The death of Maximinus Daia should have left the empire in peace, but 2 key factors were against this. First, Constantine had decided to make Christianity an integral part of his policies, and Licinius was at best a lukewarm supporter. Second, and more importantly, Constantine was determined to tolerate a rival only as long as absolutely necessary. As one historian put it, the empire was not, for all its vastness, big enough for both of them. In 316, Constantine's opportunity came. Invading on the dubious pretext that Licinius had refused to appoint one of his candidates as Caesar, Constantine swept all before him, defeating Licinius's much larger army. Licinius fled east and in desperation appointed Valens, the commander of his Danube forces, as co-emperor. Valens, who you can't help but sympathize with, assembled another army and fought Constantine to a standstill in Thrace. Constantine, realizing the difficulty of the battles ahead and probably gnashing his teeth in frustration, decided to come to terms. The treaty heavily favored him, granting him most of the Balkans, and for his reward, poor Valens was executed. The next 6 years, though peaceful, were marked by a steady deterioration in East-West relations. Constantine moved his capital east to the modern Sofia, a curious choice for one whose domain stretched all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and justifiable only if he considered Licinius more of a threat than any barbarian tribe or Western usurper. He set himself up as the protector of Christians everywhere, with the result that Licinius, while remaining generally tolerant of Christianity, began to suspect Christians of acting as a fifth column inside his territories. His mistake, however, was to act against them. In 323, he uncovered evidence that several bishops were openly conspiring against him, and he executed them and destroyed their churches. This gave Constantine just the excuse he was looking for, and the next year he invaded. Constantine soundly defeated him in a decisive battle on the banks of the Bosphorus, and, on the condition that his life would be spared, Licinius surrendered. The civil wars were over, and the Roman Empire was at last at peace. United under the strong hand of a single ruler, it must have seemed to many that a new age was dawning. He now turned his prodigious energies toward an even more difficult goal, uniting a Christianity which seemed on the brink of tearing itself apart.
He had envisioned Christianity as a uniting force, something that would tie the disparate peoples of the empire together. As there was now one emperor, there would be one church, with himself at the head. Paganism, weak and dying, could be tolerated. Christian heresies could not. But instead of a unified religion, he found a faith almost hopelessly divided by factions and torn apart by schisms. The problem was that Christianity, in its infancy, like many mystery religions, lacked an official written orthodoxy. In the first century, when Christ's words were in living memory, any conflict of interpretation could usually be cleared up by those who actually remembered him. As time went on, however, and those initial generations died off, more and more heresies began to pop up. The church tried to clarify things by holding local meetings of bishops called synods, and by issuing statements of belief called creeds, but no sooner had one issue been settled than another would pop up. So the situation stood in 320, when a young prester of Alexandria named ARIUS threatened to permanently split the Christian world. His doctrine was simple. God the Father had created Christ, so though he was a perfect man, Christ was not God. Arius was excommunicated at a synod attended by about 100 bishops, and he fled to Nicomedia, where he was warmly greeted by the Emperor Licinius himself, and a synod called by the local bishop Eusebius overwhelmingly endorsed him. Feeling much stronger, Arius returned to Alexandria and demanded to be reinstated. The bishop refused, and rioting broke out in the streets. It's important to remember at this point a fundamental difference between Byzantine society and our own. Theology was not an esoteric subject for theologians. It was a passionate concern of everyday citizens. Slogans were written on the walls, jingles were sung, and speeches were made in the marketplace. And Arius, unlike some theologians, was quite a clever songwriter, devising tunes to be whistled or sung in the streets. And so by 323, with Licinius dead and Constantine in control of the empire, what had started out as a local dispute now threatened to rip apart the empire Constantine had fought so hard to unify. His first attempt at mediation was almost painfully naive. He wrote a letter to both factions saying, "Having inquired faithfully into the origin and foundation of your differences, I find their cause to be of a truly insignificant nature, and quite unworthy of such fierce contention. It was wrong ever to propose such questions as these, or to reply to them when propounded." Such divisions, however, were too deep to simply be papered over and ignored, and Constantine soon realized that a more drastic solution was called for. The main problem was the local synods. Arius had been condemned by some and accepted by others. The obvious answer then was to call the synod to end all synods, one of such tremendous authority that both sides would accept its rulings. And so in 325, the first great council of the church was held at Nicaea. The council dealt with many issues, setting the date of Easter, for example, but from the beginning, the main concern was the description of Christ and his relationship to God the Father. The debate hinged on one word. The Orthodox bishops wanted homoousios, meaning of one substance, while the pro-Arian bishops wanted to insert an I, changing it to mean of like substance. Constantine, who throughout the council played an integral part, was able, by both persuasion and intimidation, to get both sides to agree on of one substance. Arius was officially condemned, and his written works were burnt. For Constantine, it had been a tremendous success. Not only had the matter been decided, but most of the votes had been unanimous. He had unified both the Eastern and Western churches and established his own moral superiority over it, linking church and state together with bonds that would last the next 1,000 years. The city that would become Byzantium was already 1,000 years old when Constantine first saw it, and though later legends would grow up about its divine origin, he would have needed little guidance to see its worth. The empire had many enemies, and the most formidable ones were clustered on its eastern border, the Sarmatians, Ostrogoths, and especially the Persians. Rome was far away, too hot and malarial in the summers, and too vulnerable to attack. More importantly, intellectually and economically, it had become a bit of a backwater. The new progressive Hellenistic thinking was in the east, and in an age of dwindling resources, the richer eastern provinces could not be ignored. Constantine's new city, therefore, would be something more than a commemorative city. It would be the new Rome, the new center of the world. On Monday, May 11th, 330, the city was formally dedicated to God the Father. The name was officially Nova Roma, but the new citizens, with some coaching, spontaneously christened it Constantinople. A new era had begun, and the city had grown quickly. Just 12 years before, it had been a tiny village, but within a century it would boast, in the words of the historian Gibbon, a school of learning, a circus, 2 theaters, 8 public and 153 private baths, 52 porticos, 5 granaries, 8 aqueducts, 4 spacious halls for the Senate or courts of justice, 14 churches, 14 palaces, and 4,388 houses, which, for their size or beauty, deserve to be distinguished from the multitude of plebeian habitations. Just 12 years before, it had been a tiny village, but within a century, it would soon become the greatest city of the empire. It was not just the new capital that had grown, however. Aside from a number of cities he had founded and named after himself, churches had popped up all over, mostly due to his mother, Helena. At the spry age of 72, she had set out to the Holy Land, founding churches along the way and finding the true cross. She built the Church of the Nativity at Bethlehem, one on the Mount of Olives, and most importantly, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem. She died in the Holy Land, the first recorded Christian pilgrim, and the founder of a tradition that continues to this day. At this point, an old problem resurfaced and threatened to undo all of his hard work. Never overly interested in doctrinal subtleties, he allowed himself to be convinced by whoever had his ear at the moment. ARIUS was always more popular in the East than the West, and he seems never to have taken his exile too seriously. Remaining friendly with several of the emperor's family and friends, he convinced Constantine to reinstate him. But the Egyptians had elected a firebrand named Athanasius, who flatly refused. Constantine called another council of the church, but when it became apparent that only pro-Arian bishops were going to show up, Athanasius took the opportunity to flee to Constantinople. He was deposed in his absence and banished to Trier, but when Arius was appointed, the people of Alexandria rioted in the streets. Constantine backed off his decision and recalled Arius to inquire into his beliefs, and it was during these inquiries that Arius died in a particularly gruesome fashion. Constantine's main desire was to achieve unity within both the church and the state, and he may have come close to it if he had just stuck with his original decisions. Instead, he made the situation even worse by constantly vacillating between the two camps. Athanasius's exile was to last beyond Constantine's death, and the spiritual unity he craved has still not arrived. In the early months of 337, he prepared a campaign against the Persians, but, feeling ill, he ordered his tomb prepared and was baptized. He waited until the last possible moment to be baptized to hedge his bets, because he believed that baptism would wash away all of his sins. Ironically enough, though, he was baptized by an Arian heretic. He died on the 22nd of May, after a reign of 31 years, the longest since Augustus. His body was put in a golden coffin and draped with a purple shroud. He had taken on the title Equal of the Apostles, and in death he planned to take it one step further. He had 12 sarcophagi placed in the Church of the Holy Apostles, and had his own coffin placed in the center. Not only an apostle, but apparently the symbol of the Savior in person. So does Constantine deserve to be called great? Certainly there were greater, more likable men who sat on the Byzantine throne, but none would have the lasting effect that he did. Ironically, for all his brutality and megalomania, the faith he professed would become the binding force of his empire for the next 1,000 years. It would also have an incalculable effect on the culture of the East, and continues to impact it to this day through the Orthodox Church. But as great as his direct influence was on the East, his indirect impact on the West may have been even greater. Byzantium stood as a great bulwark protecting an underdeveloped Europe against the onslaught of Islam. The walls of Constantinople forced the armies of the Prophet to take the long route through North Africa and Spain, and by the time they were stopped at the Battle of Tours, Europe had emerged from its dark ages and was ready to face them. Had Constantine chosen his city less well, or have been more ambivalent in his endorsement of Christianity, the history of the world would be vastly different. For this reason alone he deserves his title, and it's a fitting tribute that the last emperor to rule in his city also bore his name.